Chapter 7 Something Humiliating for My Kingdom. The breach was gentle, but also somehow ominous. I have discovered something humiliating for my kingdom. Menelik was writing to King Umberto of Italy. The letter was dated September 27th, 1890, about a year after Maconnen's journey to Italy. In November of the previous year, Menelik had been crowned emperor by Abuna Matthäus, the metropolitan of Ethiopia, at the Church of Mary at Entoto, in the hills above Addis Ababa. Sometime later, Menelik wrote to the various European heads of state announcing his coronation. In late February 1890, both Britain and Germany responded that, by the terms of Ethiopia's protectorate status, they should have been informed through Italy, which, as protector, handled Italy's diplomatic relations. The reply sparked a vigorous protest. Had Ethiopia agreed to protectorate status? At an elementary level, the question turned on a translation. The Treaty of Wuchale was drawn up in Amharic and Italian. In his letter of protest to Umberto, Menelik complained that while the Italian version of Article 17 seemed to oblige Ethiopia to have recourse to Italy in its dealings with other states, the Amharic version merely gave Ethiopia the option to do so. When Britain and Germany insisted upon receiving communications from Ethiopia by way of Italy, and indeed replied by way of Italy, the confusion had become evident. But had the confusion been deliberate? Discussions of the causes leading up to the war between Italy and Ethiopia have tended to take the story of Article 17 at face value, that the misunderstanding and subsequent hostilities emerged from a simple error of translation or, quote, dishonest interpretation, unquote. Certainly, the language of the treaty could have been clearer. The word protectorate appears nowhere in the document. It is only the implication of the language of Article 17 that establishes it. Still, there is plenty of reason to believe that the ambiguity of Article 17, the mistranslation, was something Menelik was aware of and was willing to live with for a time. After all, Menelik signed the treaty in early 1889. Britain and Germany both communicated with Menelik via Italy later that year, but it was only late the following year that Menelik met his formal objection. Certainly, when Menelik made his voyage to Italy to sign the treaty in the late summer of 1889, the language of protectorate was everywhere. The newspapers used the language of protectorate in their coverage, on occasion resorting to headlines blaring out the single word, protetorato. In the several weeks that Maconnen and his delegation toured Italy, the message could hardly have escaped them. There were plenty of opportunities to clear up any confusion. More to the point, both Umberto and Maconnen, in their formal addresses to each other, spoke specifically of a relationship of protection. In addressing Umberto, Maconnen stated, "In the name of my king, I ask the protection of your majesty," to which Umberto replied, "I hereby pledge myself to the protection that I and my government grant to your country." Maconnen was no fool. Although there were those at court who sometimes doubted his loyalty, who feared he would betray Menelik in order to replace him, Menelik's trust in his cousin, whom he sometimes called simply brother, was unwavering. Could Maconnen have deceived Menelik and the court by speaking one language, the language of protectorate, at Rome while speaking another at home? In the age of modern newspapers available and read in both capitals, such a feat was impossible. Instead, for Menelik, the mistranslation of Article 17 was a convenient fiction. It allowed Makonnen to go to Rome, sign the Treaty of Ujale, negotiate the additional convention, an all-important loan of 4 million lire, and return to Ethiopia, a friend of Italy. Then, more than a year later, from the safety of his secure imperial throne, Menelik could begin to disentangle himself from the partnership with Italy that had facilitated his rise. It was not yet a formal rupture. In his initial protest, Menelik used the language of a gentle friend who had been hurt, and he mostly communicated through official channels. He was in no hurry to bring down the edifice he had helped to create. For one thing, until Mangasha had been crushed as a rival to the throne, he still needed the Italians to keep arms from reaching Mangasha by way of Massawa. It would be more than a year before he would officially renounce the treaty. By then, he was ready to face whatever consequences his step might bring. Antonio Baldissera could see where this was going. As a commander of Italian forces in Africa, he argued that Italy needed to rethink its policies and alliances in the face of Menelik's rise. It was fine to back Menelik when he was the young southern upstart plotting against Emperor Johannes. According to the same logic, however, with Menelik now on Ethiopia's throne, it was time to find another internal ally, someone who could help to keep Menelik off balance and preserve Italy's margin for maneuver. Not everyone agreed. Everything turned on one view of Menelik. Pietro Antonelli, who had invested years in cultivating the Menelik relationship, argued that Menelik's ascendancy was also Italy's. Italy had backed the winning horse and was about to cash in. Baldissera saw things differently. Menelik had played Antonelli, and through him Italy, as long as he was the scrappy underdog. Now that Menelik was on top, he no longer needed Italy, hence the burgeoning misunderstanding about Article 17 of the treaty. Italy shouldn't waste any time trying to clear up the misunderstanding, Baldissera argued. Italy should find a new scrappy underdog to sponsor against Menelik. For example, Mangasha, the son of Johannes. Divide et impera, he was fond of saying in weighty Latin. Redolent of Roman imperial grandeur, divide and conquer. Baldissera got nowhere. Partly it was a matter of momentum. Italy had invested in Menelik and Shoa for so many years, it was hard to remember why it had done so. Partly it was a matter of lingering resentment. Backing Mangasha against Menelik would mean reconciling with his lieutenant Alula, the commander of the massacre of Dogali. But reconciling with Alula was politically difficult for Italy. In frustration, Baldissera resigned. The creation of Ertera. Baldissera, who led the Italian forces that occupied Asmara in August 1889 without firing a shot, stepped down in December, mere days before a signal date in the history of East Africa. On January 1st, 1890, Italy announced the formation of the colony of Ertera. Ertera derived its name from the Greek word erythros, red, thus explicitly referencing the Red Sea. The name conjured memories of classical antiquity, including inevitably the glories of the Roman Empire, whose renewal the new colony seemed to promise. Baldissera's replacement as a commander of Italian forces in East Africa, General Baldassare Orero, took up residence in Asmara, now the capital of Ertera. In General Orero, Menelik and Ethiopia acquired a true friend. The question was, did they want one? Almost immediately after establishing himself in Ertera, Orero began to think about what a good ally of Menelik would do. He hit upon the idea of marching in Ethiopia, the neighboring restive province of Tigray would do, and pacifying it for Menelik. In a letter to Rome, Orero wrote that he was contemplating a march on Adwa, where, having secured the city, he would await the arrival of Menelik. Such a move would demonstrate to Ethiopia Italy's power and value as an ally. Menelik could even use the occasion to have himself crowned in the historic holy city of Aksum. Rome responded that Orero should focus on fortifying Eritrea, to which Orero replied that the best way to defend Eritrea was by securing Tigray. At this point, Antonelli could see that the years of work that had gone into cultivating his relationship with Ethiopia were in jeopardy. He threatened to resign. But before anyone could restrain Orero, he pounced. The next time Rome heard from Orero, it was January 26, 1890, and he was writing from Adwa. Orero's Adwa adventure was a disaster. Less than 1 month after Italy announced the creation of Eritrea, Orero had carried out a new invasion of Ethiopia. If there was anyone left in Ethiopia who was unsure of Italy's expansionist intentions, those doubts crumbled. It also brought home to Menelik just how risky his pro-Italian policy had been. Although Italy had helped him to arm himself, to build his treasury, and to maneuver against Johannes, it now risked appearing to be a stooge of Italy. Certainly, he had accepted Orero's invitation and met the invading Italian forces, or even worse, had himself crowned at Aksum. As the Italians looked on as patrons, he would have suffered irremediable damage. He stayed away. Instead, Menelik extracted what he could from the episode. The pacification of Tigray and the submission of his rival Mangasha were worthy goals, provided he could keep his distance from the Italians. He marched his army northward through the Endarta region, as if heading to meet Orero, but proceeding at a steady pace. Along the way, Menelik encountered significant resistance from farmers reluctant to feed his army. Menelik continued to push northward, brutally relentless, providing a vivid demonstration of what awaited Mangasha and Tigray when he arrived. Menelik's display of determination convinced Mangasha to give in. He was about to be crushed between Menelik driving northward and the Italians pushing south. He despaired at the destruction and suffering. In late February, he set out, accompanied by an entourage of 300, to meet Menelik before and later the latter reached Tigray. He was received with honors and made his formal submission, carrying a rock on his shoulder as a symbol of his subordinate status. The battle to succeed Johannes was over. Menelik had won. Orero was sacked. His clashes with Antonelli and his rash behavior revealed him to be a liability. By April, a mere 4 months after his appointment, he was gone. By June, Oreste Baratieri was in Eritrea, along with his prize horse, Trentino, beginning an ascent that would give him executive authority in both military and civic matters for the entire colony. By 1890, Baratieri had already enjoyed a stellar career as an Italian patriot and soldier. He was born in the Alpine region of Trentino, Sud Tyrol in 1841, when not only Trentino, but also much of what is now northern Italy was under Austrian rule. Although Trentino is an area of hybrid Italian and German culture, the Baratieri family identified with Italy. Oreste attended a monastery school where he was taught by brothers of the Order of St. Francis. The young Oreste was an excellent student, a fine writer, and a spirited young man with a romantic sensibility. He was 17 when he joined Giuseppe Garibaldi's Red Shirts, an insurgent band determined to unite Italy. He was part of the legendary Red Shirt expedition that landed in Sicily in May 1860 and fought to bring Sicily and the southern Italian peninsula into modern Italy. So this is Oreste Baratieri. Success inspired Baratieri to pursue a military career. He became a captain in the army. He was wounded in the fighting that drove Austria out of Venetia and paved the way for Italian unity in 1870. He was promoted to the rank of major in 1876. He ran for election in Brescia, won, and began a 20-year stint in the Chamber of Deputies in Rome. With the idea of Italy as his guide, he had become an accomplished military political leader. He was barely 35 years old. Baratieri, Umberto, and the example of Leopold's Congo. If Baratieri ever sensed the eerie parallel between Ethiopian efforts to be rid of Italy and his own efforts to rid Italy of the Austrians, he didn't write it down. By the time he shipped out to Massawa, he had moved ever deeper into Italy's budding imperialist circles. As a result of his travels and his military service in North Africa, Baratieri came into the orbit of their geographical society, which in Italy, as everywhere else, was an incubator of colonialist sentiment. Baratieri made an effective colonial advocate. He had honed his writing skills as editor of Rivista Militare, Italy's major military periodical, which helped to get him elected to the governing council of the Geographical Society. There he came to admire the work of King Leopold of Belgium. In the 1870s, Leopold had asserted that tiny Belgium was small, happy, content. Yet by the 1880s, Leopold was well on his way to carving out a vast African enterprise for himself in Congo. The example of Leopold fired imaginations in expansionist circles by showing that even small countries could accomplish grand colonial feats. Soon, King Umberto was emphasizing commercial and maritime themes. Baratieri was an avid reader. By the time he arrived at Massawa in 1890, he was already an amateur African anthologist seeking to gain tactical advantage over Ethiopia's adversaries by exploiting their differences. As he rose in authority, he sought out partnerships with local chiefs in Eritrea, playing on both their resentment of Mangasha's heavy-handed rule and their fear of Menelik and rule from the south. In each case, his pitch was the same. Italian rule was better, less burdensome, more liberal than any local alternative. The showcase figure was Bata Hagos. For years prior to the arrival of the Italians in the highlands, Bata had lived in the life of Shifta, a bandit. He and his men pounced on caravans making their way between Massawa and the coast. As the authority of the Ethiopian state expanded, first under Tedros, then under Yohannes and Menelik, his room for maneuver became constrained. The arrival of the Italians provided a counterweight to Ethiopian authority, which had encroached on his autonomy and his income. A courtship of mutual interest began. Italy struck a deal with Bata, recognizing his regional authority, including an administrative capital at Saganaiti. The ascent of the Shifta had begun. Bata's collaboration brought him power and legitimacy. His service as Italian regional administrator came with authority to mobilize a military force numbering in the hundreds. This made Bata powerful, but as he was now Italy's ally, the deal also increased Italian firepower at minimal additional expense. In exchange for his administrative and military service, Bata was authorized to exact a tribute of 10%, a tithe, in effect, on the population in his region. It was even said that Bata had converted to Roman Catholicism. The Italians were providing themselves a debt at expansion and consolidation via co-optation of local leaders. Bata entertained lavishly. Rosalia Pianavia, who confessed to a fascination for Bata, remarked on his pride, his imposing presence, and his air of mystery. She was less admiring of his methods as a ruler. Bata was more feared than loved. The fascination was mutual. Bata developed an infatuation for Rosalia, even though, or perhaps because, she was the spouse of one of the ranking Italian officers. Mimetic desire requires no translation. Bata visited Rosalia in great pomp, preceded by soldiers and musicians blasting out a tune in their melekat horns. Bata followed on a white mule whose pink saddlecloth was embroidered in silver. Rosalia was flattered by the spectacle, and Bata left enchanted. More cordial visits ensued, and Bata's fascination did not abate. Politics would soon dampen his ardor. Ertra Settlement Colony. On November 10th, 1893, 9 Italian families, 50 individuals in all, arrived in the highlands of the new colony of Ertra. The event represented the fulfillment of a cherished vision to find an outlet for Italy's burgeoning population. In 1891, just a year after the noisy proclamation of Ertra as a colony, a parliamentary commission had set off for Massawa. Its task was to determine the suitability of Ertra for settlement. Every year, thousands of Italians left Europe for a new life in the Americas, where they started over as Brazilians, Argentinians, or Americans. For some political leaders, finding an outlet for all this youthful vigor became a national priority. A member of the Chamber of Deputies, Leopoldo Franchetti, became the leading advocate for the vision of Ertra as a settlement colony. Franchetti soon encountered resistance, not so much at first from Africans, but from the Italian civil and military authorities. Franchetti's vision of colonial Ertra was populist. If landless Italians were being lost to the Americas, he argued, then it was the landless who should be invited and subsidized as farmers and settlers in the new colony of Ertra. Unless the colony was properly settled by family farmers, Franchetti argued, well-capitalized investors could seize the best land and simply reproduce the quasi-plantation system, vast latifundia, that hampered the development of southern Italy. Franchetti's idea of subsidized settlers faced resistance on a number of levels. Ertra was a huge drain on Italy's budget. Any funds had to be coaxed from a legislature that was skeptical of the value of colonial enterprise. Unless new money was found, Franchetti's subsidies for settlers could be diverted from other colonial interests, including the army. The army was already starved for resources. It viewed resettling landless Italian peasants in Ertra as a luxury, even a burden. What the army wanted above all was stable, well-capitalized, large-scale farmers who would be allies in the conquest and pacification of Ertra, something closer to the stable, wealthy settler communities the French were establishing in North Africa. Franchetti's Vision 1, the work of building a settler's Ertra, began. Franchetti's settlement plan offered generous inducements, the Italian equivalent of 40 acres and a mule. Each family was promised 20 hectares, nearly 50 acres, in perpetuity, provided they occupied and cultivated the land for 5 years. Startup costs, travel to Ertra, seed, tools, a dwelling, and an advance on the first year's crop yield were provided in the form of a loan, payable in cash or in kind, and at an interest rate of 3%. From his position as the head of the Office of Settlement, Franchetti was tireless in his advocacy. Between 1893 and 1895, some 400,000 hectares, nearly 1 million acres of the finest farm and pasture land in Eritrean highlands were set aside for settlers and ruled off limits to the local African population. Rather than try to create an organic community from scratch, colonial administrators transplanted parts of existing communities. The first settler families were drawn from 2 villages. 7 families were from the Lombard town of Magenta. The other 2 hailed from the Sicilian town of Pedara near Catania. Adi Ugri, a site about 30 miles south of Asmara, was chosen for the settlement. The new village was baptized Umberto I, after the King of Italy. Its layout tells us something about what were considered the essentials of Italian village life. The village of Umberto was laid out in a grid around a central piazza, which featured a windmill and a communal oven. Upon arrival, each family was assigned 2 tukul, the native huts of straw and wood typical in the highlands. Likewise, each family received a livestock allotment of 8 cattle, 10 chickens, and a piglet. 9 farming plots, 1 per family, were laid out around the perimeter of the settlement. By the time of the official inauguration of the village of Umberto in May 1893, furrows had been cut, irrigation canals dug, vines planted, and coffee plants started. A large tent was set up near the fields for Catholic Mass. Father Bonomi, the army chaplain, used the occasion to offer words of encouragement and to prepare the intrepid settlers for the inevitable disappointments of settler life. Then the village was duly blessed. Father Bonomi, dressed in his most colorful vestments and bearing a monstrance, led a benedictory procession around the perimeter, just as he might have in Italy, blessing the fields and the tukuls. A few weeks later, in late July, Rosalia Oldani, Eritrea's first settler infant, was born. Despite such a promising display of fecundity, the settlement would come to an abrupt end. Public opinion in Italy remained skeptical. The contrast between the bleak poverty of the Italian countryside and the generous subsidies offered to the families of Umberto, 4,000 lire, a princely sum, fed claims of colonial boondoggle. What might these lire buy if properly invested in the farmers of Mezzogiorno, Italy's impoverished south? But the real pressure came from displaced Africans. What could be more arrogant than to push a population abruptly from 1 million acres of the best land? Some land had been abandoned, how much we'll never know, to the highland population of Eritrea, and Ethiopia struggled with the consequences of rinderpest, a viral disease that killed cattle. Since the introduction of rinderpest, most likely by way of cattle imported from India via Massawa, the highlands population had languished. Without cattle for dairy, meat, and farm labor, the Ethiopian population had endured years of famine and illness, from 1888 to 1892. Estimates of casualties range from 1/10 to 1/3 of the Ethiopian population. From Rome, Francesco Crispi urged Italian military leaders to treat under-farmed land as abandoned and, quote, at the mercy of the first occupant, unquote, namely Italian settlers. Building on Franchetti's populist vision, Crispi imagined an enrooted peasant soldier, an African Cincinnatus, eager to defend his land and with it Eritrea. Instead, the boldness of the Italian settlement initiative aroused the local population, which could now plainly see what was in store for them. A few weeks later, at 9 o'clock in the morning of June 2nd, 1894, Menelik's archival Mangasha entered Addis Ababa, accompanied by his lieutenants, including the formidable Alula. As they approached Menelik's palace, each shouldered a stone, a sign of repentance and submission. They had submitted before in 1890, but this occasion occurred in new circumstances and with additional pomp. Drums and horns played from the imperial closure. The clamor exceeded only when Mangasha crossed into the royal compound with his unarmed soldiers and his clergy. Menelik's troops fired their rifles into the air in celebration. Mangasha and his lieutenants approached Menelik's throne. Mangasha removed the stone from his soldier and placed it at Menelik's feet. Then he and his entourage prostrated themselves in front of the emperor, completing the ritual of submission. From a naive point of view, it was a triumph not only for Menelik, but also for Italy, his partner. In fact, the ceremony of June 1894 signaled a decisive moment in the creation of modern Ethiopia. Tigray, through Mangasha, bound its fate to that of Ethiopia. Mangasha had no alternative but to accept Menelik's leadership in the face of Italy's encroachments. By the end of the year, the revolt against Italy would begin. Against the bite of the white serpent, Bata, Hagos, and Mangasha. In late December 1894, Bata Hagos attended a dinner at the home of the chief Italian resident at Saganaiti. At the beginning of the evening, he and his companions rose to take their leave. They turned on their host and tied him up. "Go ahead, but Italy is great," shouted the resident defiantly. Bata shot back. "Italy is greater still." Bata, the slippery bandit, the convert, the collaborator, had chosen Ethiopia. Bata's men beat the drum, the chitet, in a call to arms. They also seized 2 Italian telegraph specialists. In a gentlemanly gesture, Bata assured his captives that their arrest was nothing personal. The colonial settlement had set him off. Italy was taking the best land, whose Italy soldiers were taking the women too, as Madama. Nation, land, women. The loyalties were hard to disentangle, but the choice of revolt was clear. And there was the prickly matter of race. When an associate asked why he rebelled, Bata offered a colorful analogy. When the white serpent has once bitten you, you will search in vain for the cure. 3 days later, Bata was dead. His men had answered his call for an uprising, but they were no match for the forces sent against him. As for the general population, they had their resentments against Italy, but Bata's reputation was tarnished too, leaving the locals confused in their loyalties and thus largely passive. Major Pietro Toselli had been ordered to Saganaiti along with 1,500 men to investigate. As Bata could counter with a force of 700 at most, the failure of his revolt was sealed. To his great credit, Bata released his hostages, rather than take their lives in a vengeful gesture. Bata himself fell in a hail of bullets at Halai. He ascended to whatever paradise is reserved for bandit heroes. Bata's revolt was only the beginning. The day after Bata's death, Mangasha rallied his forces at Intisho to the east of its capital at Adwa. He offered a peaceful explanation. The Muslim dervishes were on the move again, and he was preparing to defend against them. However, as Mangasha's forces, estimated at 19,000 men, amassed menacingly near the frontier of the newly proclaimed Italian colony of Ertera. Mangasha's dervish cover story was greeted with skepticism. Oreste Baratieri, commander of the Italian forces, assembled 9,000 men and marched southward. He didn't confront Mangasha's forces directly. Mangasha had left Adwa, his capital, undefended. Baratieri marched toward Adwa, unopposed, and on December 28th entered the town. There is nothing quite like a triumphant entry into an undefended capital to make a point. A leader who cannot defend his people or the seat of his power is no leader at all. In Adwa, Baratieri received gestures of support and submission, notably from the clergy. However, Mangasha was anything but through. His army was intact, and Ertera lay before him. Just as Baratieri had ignored Mangasha and marched directly to Adwa, Mangasha was in a position to march on Asmara, or even all the way to Massawa and the coast. Like Sherman's march through the south, Mangasha might simply ignore his enemy, push past him, and shatter the myth of colonial Ertra with a single devastating march to the sea. Such an exploit would have made Mangasha a national hero and bolstered his claim to his father's throne. In fact, just such a nightmare scenario for Minilik prompted wild rumors in Addis. It was said that Mangasha had defeated Baratieri and was well on his way to Massawa. These were only rumors, of course. Still, after 3 days in Adwa, the thought of Ertra at the mercy of Mangasha chastened Baratieri. He withdrew back north as Mangasha began a tentative move into Ertra. Given that Mangasha's forces outnumbered his own by more than 2-1, a direct confrontation was out of the question. Baratieri shadowed Mangasha and his forces as they moved north, waiting for an opportune moment to attack. Late in the afternoon on January 12, 1895, Baratieri's scouts located Mangasha's forces, encamped near Kwatit. Baratieri's men occupied a dominant position overlooking Mangasha's camp, while Mangasha remained unaware of their arrival. Fighting began the next day with neither side victorious, though Mangasha's forces suffered greater casualties. On the 14th, Mangasha withdrew toward the south, toward home, under cover of darkness. At dawn on the 15th, Baratieri and his men awoke to find Mangasha's camp vacant. Having turned back Mangasha's invasion, Baratieri sought to turn Mangasha's retreat into a rout. Although Mangasha had at least a 6-hour lead, Baratieri's forces pursued, making up 25 miles in less than a day. Late in the afternoon, they came upon Mangasha encamped at Sanafe. Within minutes, Italian artillery deployed and opened fire, wreaking havoc on Mangasha's camp, including a direct hit on Mangasha's tent. Mangasha survived the attack and fled with his army, leaving his camp in shattered disarray. Mangasha's tent, damaged by artillery fire, became a trophy for Baratieri and his men. Its contents, including a chest that served as Mangasha's mobile archives, would yield precious intelligence. Weeks later, on March 1st, 1895, Mangasha tried to explain away what had happened in a repentant letter to Baratieri. The animosity was the work of Satan, he wrote, suggesting that when he invaded Ertra, he had simply been possessed by a very bad idea. Mangasha's captured archives showed otherwise. They contained an extensive correspondence that showed that Mangasha was anything but a rogue performer. He certainly wasn't possessed by the devil. Rather, he had been incited to act by Minilik himself. Among the trove of correspondence was a letter from Minilik telling Mangasha that his enemies, the Italians, continued to talk down Mangasha at court, repeating brazen calumnies. There was also evidence that the revolt of Batahagos had been coordinated with the full knowledge not only of Mangasha, but also of Minilik. If the Italians had any remaining illusions about Minilik, they now dissipated. Their protege, the man they had supported in an attempt to harry Johannes, The man whose ascendancy they had counted as their own was now without a doubt their most formidable enemy. Moreover, in attacking and routing Mangasha, the Italians both achieved a great military victory and inflicted upon themselves a catastrophic strategic defeat. Mangasha had been the only credible rival to Menelik's authority. It was said that he and Alula had been ready to deal with the Italians against Menelik, an arrangement that would have given Italy great leverage to use against Menelik. Instead, by defeating Mangasha, Baratieri had done Menelik's dirty work. Mangasha was now reduced to a bandit in the hills of Tembien. The remark attributed to Cesar Nerazzini captured a sad truth. Mangasha had been humiliated, reduced to a mere shifta. But it missed a still greater truth, that Ethiopia itself had been pushed into Menelik's arms along with Mangasha. The nation at large knew that Ethiopia now had only one credible defender, Emperor Menelik, King of Kings, Lion of the tribe of Judah. As for the Italians, the next time they would see Mangasha would be on the battlefield at Adwa, fighting as part of Menelik's army. While still basking in the glory of his victories, Baratieri filed his expense sheet for the campaign against Mangasha. His costs came to 500,000 lire, a bargain well under $100,000. By comparison, American Civil War costs typically exceeded $1 million per day. When George Berkeley translated Baratieri's 500,000 lire figure into terms his reader could understand, he came up with 19,000 euros, a price often paid for a house in London. This truly was empire on the cheap. Baratieri's secret, of course, was the Askari mercenaries. By hiring Africans to fight Africans, Baratieri avoided the cost of mobilizing, training, and paying European troops. The commanding officers at Coatit and Senafe were Italians, but the men lobbying shells into Mangasha's tent were Africans, paid at African rates. Baratieri also avoided the political cost of reporting the deaths of European soldiers. After one of his engagements with Mangasha's forces, Baratieri duly reported his casualties to Rome. 11 dead and 30 wounded. None were white. Not only were Baratieri's victories cheap, but they cost little in European lives. The final irony was that Baratieri's victories of late 1894 and early 1895 laid the foundation for his defeat at Adwa. They did so by creating expectations that were completely unrealistic. The rapid suppression of Bata's chaotic revolt and the comic collapse of Mangasha's forces in flight underpinned an invalid assessment of Ethiopian military valor. Meanwhile, the cheapness of the campaign encouraged Italian political leadership to underestimate the cost, both in terms of cash and in European lives, of the full-scale war Menelik was already preparing. Baratieri pushes into Ethiopia. Baratieri's campaigns against Bata, Hagos, and Mangasha vaulted him to celebrity status. In Italy, avid colonialists reached back to the glories of ancient Rome for proper comparison. They hailed Baratieri as the new Scipio Africanus, after the general of Roman antiquity who had defeated the Carthaginians in North Africa. In Ertra, Baratieri's success led to calls to follow up his victories with a campaign into the northern Ethiopian province of Tigray. Such a campaign, it was argued, would consolidate Baratieri's victory by permanently weakening Mangasha. It would also give Ertra a more defensible natural frontier. Mangasha and his army had descended into Ertra from the higher elevations of Tigray. Italian control of a line of mountains from Adwa to Adigrat would form a natural defense. from which Ertra could repel any invasion. The only catch was that such an occupation of Tigray was sure to raise hackles in Addis. If Italy took Tigray, what would Menelik do? Without awaiting to answer this question, Baratieri moved. 2 days after Mangasha's contrite work of Satan letter, on March 3rd, 1895, Italian forces occupied the town of Adigrat. Adigrat is a market town set in a fertile valley. It sits almost on top of East Africa's great watershed. East of Adigrat, the rivers flow to the Red Sea. Rivers west of Adigrat drain to the Nile. Of all the regions and settlements to fall into Italian hands in 1895, Adigrat was the most alluring. Besides being the capital of the Agame region, at more than 8,000 feet, it stood aloof of the malarial lowlands, and its temperature was mild, even at near equatorial latitudes. Caravans to Adigrat could count on a 7-day journey from Massawa. From a military point of view, that was a long way, but Italy now had a series of fortified positions: Massawa, Ginda, Asmara, Gura, Kwatit, Sanafe, Barakit, Adigrat, all the way up from the coast. A fort at Adigrat, which the Italians immediately set about building, could be provisioned and reinforced with relative ease. Baratieri wrote a lengthy report to Rome, praising the settlement prospects of Adigrat and the Agame region. "It is very rich and very productive," he wrote, adding that it is just right for Italian colonialization. But Mangasha remained an irresistible lure. Adigrat had fallen into Italian hands, but Mangasha, by either dumb luck or wily evasion, managed to remain at large, always just out of reach. Baratieri took the bait. He dispatched an Askari column to pursue Mangasha as far as Megale, where Baratieri himself went westward to occupy Adwa and the Tigray region. In early April, Baratieri received homage and gestures of submission from the clergy of Adwa and Aksum, but he misread their accommodation as gratitude for the Italian presence. The challenge for Baratieri was to know where to stop. The lure of Mangasha, the irresistible bait, would drive Baratieri to push as far south as Alage, nearly doubling the area under Italian control. But it did nothing to make Ertra any more secure, and it seems never to have occurred to Baratieri how he would hold, much less administer, such a vast territory. Years later, he would concede that it was a mistake. At the time, in the heady aftermath of victory, he adopted the tone of a conqueror. "Tigray awaits Italian occupation," he told Rome, casting Tigray in the role of impatient maiden, with Italy playing gallant suitor. Pause. Baratieri set out a systematic plan for occupation and colonization of the new territories in 7 typeset pages. The newly conquered lands of Tigray, Agame, and Darta, and more were to be Italianized. Ethiopian farmers would be bought out in order not to create ill will, to make way for an Italian settler population. Once the settler communities were established, Ascari veterans would be settled on farmland around the periphery of the Italian settlements as a reward for faithful service, but also to create a security buffer. There would be churches, schools, clinics, Italian language classes, and entire cultural infrastructure. Baratieri's grand vision soon ran into political and economic realities. Resistance to colonialism, both in the Chamber of Deputies and among the general public, forced Crispi to rein in spending. When Baratieri asked for 13 million lire, a mere pittance, Crispi told him to make do with 9 million, telling him that Napoleon made war with the money of the defeated. It was a remark that combined the grandiose with comic irony. When Napoleon made war with the money of the defeated in the 1790s, he was looting the wealthy provinces of northern Italy, not the plague and war-depleted provinces of northern Ethiopia. Baratieri was frustrated and asked to be replaced. In May 1895, Crispi refused Baratieri's request for replacement. Instead, he recalled him to Italy to discuss plans and budgets in person. Baratieri returned to Italy in July 1895. He was feted at banquets hosted by pro-colonial groups. Medals were struck in his honor as the hero of Coati and Senafe. Baratieri used such occasions to drum up public support for his vision of resurrected imperial Rome. Give me 10 million lire and I will haul Menelik to Rome, he promised. It was an allusion to the Gallic Wars of Julius Caesar, who famously defeated the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix and had him brought to Rome in chains. Costly colonial wars were a tough sell, not only to a diffident Italian public, but also in Italy's Chamber of Deputies. In Rome, Matteo Ambriani, a patriot who, like Baratieri, had fought with Garibaldi, pushed back. On July 25th, as Baratieri sought to conjure Roman glories, Imbriani presented a legislative motion rejecting the government's, quote, colonial war of conquest, unquote. He called on Prime Minister Francesco Crispi to abandon it. Crispi shot back, portraying Italy's land grab as a necessity act of defense, one that justified a long-term presence. Quote, if fortune of arms had given us the territory we now occupy, we cannot abandon it, he argued before the deputies. Like it or not, the new territories were a fait accompli. The next day, Baratieri met with Crispi and his ministries of finance, war, and foreign affairs. He had reduced his original request for 13 million lire to 10 million, but Crispi still would go no higher than 9. Afterward, Baratieri went on vacation. He visited his family in Trentino for alpine picnics and boating. He muled over his choices. In September, he visited with Crispi once more, then headed for Brindisi, where he departed for Africa. Prey to vanity, self-doubt, and a blind patriotism, Baratieri had given in. He was deeply attached to his status as military commander-in-chief and governor of Ertra. The thought of resigning in the face of unacceptable constraints, as Baldissera had done before him, was foreign to his rigid sense of duty. Italy, his madre patria, mother fatherland, as he repeatedly referred to it, claimed every ounce of his filial piety, all of his devotion. He couldn't say no. End of part 1.